Jan taught for 16 years from preschool in America to a range of contexts in the UK, from primary to sixth form. 10 years as a local authority school improvement advisor, leading government projects from healthy schools to targeted mental health in schools, and working with schools across the UK and internationally, has given Jan many opportunities to develop programs relating mental and emotional health to learning. She is also a qualified counsellor and psychotherapist, and brought these areas of expertise together to create Jigsaw, the mindful approach to PSHE for ages 3 to 16. So welcome, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gosh, no wonder I'm this age. I've packed a lot in. So thank you very much. Next slide, please. Can I do this myself, or is it perfect? So today I want to talk to you about relationships and why relationships education is so absolutely vital. I'm going to talk quite quickly because we've just lost a few minutes there. I'm not going to talk loads about Jigsaw, just give a few examples from it at the end, because that's not what this is all about. But I will use some examples from it because I think there's a lot of schools using Jigsaw now, and so it's kind of tried and tested. Oh.
Nicola, someone's come on to the same. Oh, hang on.
Okay, next slide, please. Lovely. We're going to nip on through the slides quite quickly. So today then, I just want to share with you three things really. The first is just a little bit of theory that lies behind this passion of mine to make sure that we get the relationships education as right as we possibly can from as early an age as we possibly can. Just a quick refresher on how that all fits together with the statutory relationships and health education requirements that are now in place, and then a bit more about the how. So how do we do it? So all this theory is okay, but how do we actually nurture relationship with self and relationship with others, and particularly how do we do that with making a PSHE program and an RSHE program the kind of core and the bedrock of all of that. Next slide, please. So in this current climate, how relevant to be talking about relationships? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think all of us during this year, if we didn't appreciate our relationships before now, we certainly are during this year. And I think one of the good things that's come out of this is really that people are appreciating school more, and they're appreciating their relationships more. And perhaps the good side of people is actually coming out with their support for neighbours and community and so on. So I think what we found is what we all know already, is that relationship with others is really key. We're social beings and we need that connection with other people. But one of the things I want to suggest in this session today is that some of the quality of our relationships with others also is dependent upon the quality of relationships that we have with ourselves. And very often in relationships education, we don't really see that bit coming through. We see a lot about other people, relationships with others, with friends, with families, boyfriends, girlfriends, you name it. But what I want to start looking at today is this relationship with self, how and why that's important, and how we actually do that in a school situation. Next slide. And of course, one day this all will be over, and as I say, we'll be appreciating our relationships even more, I'm sure. Next slide, please. So is there a graphic that comes with this one? No. Okay. Well, in the 5 ways to well-being in the NHS model, one of those 5 ways, one is learning, but one of them is keeping active, but one of them is connect. So even in this, the NHS trying to look at well-being across the whole community is saying connection with others is really important. We might want to also make that connection with nature, connection with the spiritual dimension, but in this context, in the NHS work, it's really looking at connection with other people, which none of this is surprising to us, I'm sure. Thank you. Next slide. So really, in essence, connection then obviously is a human need, but I want to suggest that so is time alone, because to have these positive relationships with other people, we also need to focus on having a positive relationship with ourselves. And I'm sure this is not new to you, but just want to stress that in this relationships education context. Thank you. Next. So just want to ask you then, you don't have to tell me, you can write things down if you want to, so just thinking about you, your own relationship with you. So if you had to give yourself a score out of 10, 10 being absolutely great, I feel great about myself, don't have any worries about that, I feel really good about who I am, that's a 10. 1 is the other end of the spectrum. Just give yourself in your head a score out of 10. Right at this minute, how do you feel about your relationship with you? Thank you. Next. And somehow or other, we seem to not be getting the nice graphics that come along in these slides. So I'm not quite sure why that is. Graham, if there's anything we can do about it, it would be really nice. So imagine there's a mirror on this slide, and I just want you to think, okay, this morning when you got out of bed, got out of the shower, looked in the mirror, at that point, what was your score out of 10? Looking at yourself in the mirror this morning, what was your score out of 10? And next slide, please. And then if you look even deeper and you look inside to who you really think you are, warts and all, who do you believe you are? When you really go deep inside and look at yourself, what score would you give yourself then? About you, deep inside, you as a human being, what score then? Thank you. Next slide. Yay, we got pictures. So this business about relationship with self is absolutely key. So what is relationship? We all know about this. The way in which 2 or more people, groups, countries, and so on, relate to each other, connect with each other. So in essence, the way in which 2 or more people or things are connected. So as I say, all about relationships with others, whether it's family, friends, partners, dogs, whoever. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. But this relationship with self, so the one before, please, Graham. So the relationship with self is key. So everything we do, now, if I was with you in person, you could argue with me much more readily than you can in this context. But please do get on the chat and argue if you don't agree with me. So, because I'm going to rattle on through here and try and explain why I think this is so important. So my starting point here is that literally everything we do, and that means I'm talking about us as adults, but actually everything we're talking about in terms of ourselves, we can also relate to children. And I'll do that in a minute, because that's the point at which this becomes hugely important in terms of children, their happiness, their health, their well-being, their relationship with others, and their learning. So the relationship with self underpins everything. It becomes this lens through which we see everything else, really. Thank you. Next slide. So, brilliant. So if you were to draw a line across a piece of paper, or if I was there with you, we do this, physically do this, imagining that there's a continuum across the floor. in the room that you're in, and you can happily do this with children. So at one end of this line, of this continuum, it means if I'm standing at that end, I'm really rubbish at this. On the other end of the continuum, if I'm standing at that end, I'm brilliant at it. So imagine I'm there with you and we've got this scenario going on, and I say to you, please stand on the continuum as to how you see yourself in terms of swimming. So it wouldn't be a problem for you to you'd either be at the rubbish end, the brilliant end, or somewhere in the middle. What about if I said to you, place yourself on the continuum in terms of saving money? And we'd have people spread out all the way along the continuum. And then cooking, where would you put your cross on the line? Playing football, where are you going to put your cross on the line? Spelling, staying calm, making friends, and so on. So, imagining that this was you doing this, or indeed imagining this was children doing this activity, not difficult to place yourself somewhere on the line. Now, why I'm suggesting that we do that is because I don't think anybody would have had to stand there for 2 minutes thinking, now, where am I with swimming? Now, am I good at cooking today or aren't I? Where am I with saving money? You would automatically be able to stick yourself on that line because internally you have a picture of who you are and what you believe you're good at, not good at. So next slide, please, Graham. So what I'm saying is that we have an internal picture, the internal picture being who I believe myself to be. Now, if I asked you to just write down 3 words to describe who you believe you are, just want you to think for a moment, what would those 3 words be? If you were describing this inner picture, so who do I believe myself to be? And then if you actually think, first of all, think how hard or easy is that exercise to do? And secondly, think if you asked your children to do this, what would they write? How would they be seeing themselves right now? Do they see themselves as shy, outgoing, confident, good learners, sporty, good friends? What is their perception of who they actually are? Because this is hugely significant. Thank you. Next slide, please, Graham. Okay, thank you. So the relationship with self then is the way in which I talk to, behave towards, and deal with myself based on who I believe myself to be. This then creates the lens. So this internal picture that we all hold of ourselves creates the lens through which we see everything. So I want you to think, if you work in nursery or reception, those very young children will already be coming into school with a ready-made internal picture of who they believe themselves to be. And probably cannot verbalize that, of course, but they will be acting according to that picture. Your key stage 1, key stage 2, particularly upper key stage 2, they will be able to unpack this with you for themselves. And that's one of the things I'm going to ask us to try to do in our relationships education, to empower children to actually unpack some of this for themselves safely. Thank you. Next slide, please. So sometimes people call this internal picture the internal working model. So this internal picture I hold of how I see myself. Now, why this is important in terms of relationships education is because how I see myself directly relates to how I fit with other people and how I get on with other people, whether I trust people, whether I rely on them, whether I'm a follower, whether I'm a leader, whether other people are a source of fear to me or threat to me, whether I feel I have to be defensive with other people or whether I am confident that I will fit in. So all of this stuff that's inside acts as a filter. So I'm laboring this point because it's so vitally important. Thanks. Next slide, Graham. Smashing. So this, if you could see all the pictures, I have no idea why these images are not coming up. I'm so sorry, because it was all perfectly fine when we had a dry run last week. But why is this so important for children and young people? Basically, on here, I've got lots of pictures of kind of Facebook, Twitter, all the sorts of influences that surround young people, not just media and social media, but their friends, their relationships, the school, the culture we live in, and so on. So children are constantly, there's all of this stuff coming at them, surrounding them. And actually, if they've not got a strong internal picture of who they are, then those are the children, it's very easy for them to get buffeted about, not quite have a strong sense of identity, and therefore need to find that somewhere else. And I'm sure you could all straight right now tell me the children in your class who you would see as having a strong self-identity, and those you might be concerned about because they don't have that sense of strength, internal strength. So this is where we're getting to the nitty-gritty, really, of where children can, how what I'm talking about, this relationship with self, how it impacts in such a big way on children themselves, their happiness, but also on how they access learning. Thank you. Next slide, please. So all of these things, as I'm saying, we've got a picture, all of these things are pushing and pulling and influencing how children see themselves and how they fit in. Thank you. Next slide. Brilliant. So this is why, so move on, Graham, I've already said this. Thank you. Fab. Next slide. Thank you. So bear with me just on this last little bit of explanation in terms of the theory, if you would. So, and then please do argue with me at the end. I'll try and go quick enough so we've got some time at the end for questions. So if you think of the human mind as this really, really complex entity that can be your best friend or your worst enemy, I'm sure all of us know what that self-talk feels like when it's not on a great day, when it's on a bit of a roll in terms of self-criticism, but equally when we're feeling okay and we're positive and we can praise ourselves and build ourselves up. So this theory that I've tried to simplify what I think mental health's about and how the mind works, and therefore how learning happens over the years. And this has served me quite well, but you may not agree. Think for a minute about the conscious mind, the mind we're working with right now in this present moment. All of the inputs are coming in from outside of us, coming into our conscious mind. So that might be verbal inputs from other people, things that people say to me, things that, or might be non-verbal, the looks people give you, or the culture we live in. So what I'm going to suggest in this model, it's not really rocket science, is that literally since the moment we're born, if not before, thousands and thousands and thousands of messages or pieces of input are coming into our conscious minds. And I sort of see these as little pieces of jigsaw puzzle, each with a message on them. So one might be, you're really good at art. When you're 5 and you take a picture home and one of your parents says, "Oh, that's brilliant. Let's put it on the fridge," or "Let's show it to grandma." But, equally, you might have other messages coming in, or some of the children that you're working with may have other messages coming in, which are definitely not positive. They might be things like, you'll never be as good as your brother, or you'll never be any good at maths because, I'm not, so you won't be. Look at what you've done today. Or worse still, we don't really want you, you're not lovable, you're in the way. So all of these messages are coming into our conscious minds. And so I'm talking on an adult level, but think at the same time, if this makes sense for us, then this is also what's happening for our children. So inputs are coming into the conscious mind all the time. Now, if we don't employ a filter system, these pieces of input, these messages about who we are, what we're good at, what kind of person we are, and so on, sink into the subconscious mind. And one of the functions of the subconscious mind is to create this internal picture, to put all these pieces together and make that internal picture or that internal working model. Now, that's okay, but let's look. We've got two things going on here so far, and I want you to think how, if there's something in this model, what difference can this make for us at school? So first of all, we've got to think about the inputs that children are receiving, both the verbal and the non-verbal. Then we've got to think about the filter system. So, for example, as a fairly aware adult, if somebody says to me this afternoon, I don't know why you've got your hair that colour now, Jan, it was much better when it was blonde. Now, I can choose to bat that away and not take it on board, or I can choose to let it sink into my subconscious and let it kind of brew around in there and think, perhaps I should change it back to blonde. Perhaps I should. It can make me question myself, or I can bat it away. So I've worked really successfully, and I'm sure you have, with children on this filter system thing. Now, if we can help children, firstly, be aware of the inputs that are coming in. Secondly, be aware that they can employ a filter system. So I've worked with children often on children who are on the receiving end of bullying behaviour, and tried to work with them to strengthen them up, give them an internal pictures that will help them actually not allow that bullying behaviour to really impact deeply on them. So I sort of working with this filter system, doing all sorts of visualization work to help them bat the nastiness away, if you like. So inputs come in. If we don't filter them, they sink into the subconscious and they piece together an internal picture. That's pretty obvious, I think. But what this model goes on to say is one more thing. It says the subconscious gets really active. And what the subconscious does is makes us behave in accordance with this internal picture. So obviously when we're in a classroom, when we're in school, we're seeing the output, we're seeing the behaviours, we're seeing the relationships, we're seeing children's responses to each other, to us, and so on. We're looking at the end of this cycle, the outward manifestation of what's happening within this cycle. So what I'm saying is the behaviours are then directly related to that internal picture. So what we have to do is we have to use positive behaviour management techniques. Of course we do, hopefully self-empowering children to do so. But we also, I think, for lasting change, need to be helping children to look at what's motivating those behaviours. So what's in this internal picture that's actually creating and motivating these behaviours? So the input comes in. If we don't filter it, it creates this internal picture in the subconscious. There's going to be good bits in there and not so good bits in there. And the active subconscious makes us behave in accordance with that internal picture. So the good news here is that if the internal picture that we're holding at the moment has been created by all of the inputs we've received so far, then it stands to reason if we change the inputs or add lots more positive ones, we're going to change the internal picture to a much more positive one, and the behaviors will follow. So in a minute, I'll try and relate this to how we go about doing this for children, both explicitly and implicitly, and particularly through PSHE. Okay, thank you, Graham. So I'm sure you're more than aware of this, that, you know, relationship matters hugely from day one, actually before the child's even born. So what the neuroscientific research tells us is that the relationship between the baby and the very young child and their primary caregiver, whichever parent that might be or whichever primary caregiver that is absolutely vital. And one of the things it does is the appropriate parenting, the good enough parenting, the appropriate soothing and taking care of a child's needs at that very early stage. If those things are not there, it could very easily impair the development of the brain, the physiology of the brain, and particularly that part of the brain which allows us to self-regulate our emotions. So this is massive, because I'm sure that you, just like I have many times, you could tell me about children who just can't have such a struggle managing their emotions. And we've got to try and constantly be helping them to learn how to do that. So, you know, this relationship business is hugely important. The good news here is that because the brain has plasticity, we can also change it. So I want to suggest very strongly that a really strong, appropriate relationships in the school setting can do a lot to compensate for the deficits that may have happened earlier on. Next slide, please. And my question here is, you're all very well of good old Maslow's hierarchy of human need, but how many of these needs could ever be met without a quality relationship or relationships being part of that person's development? Impossible to actually feel friendship and companionship. Not sure how easy it would be to find a sense of identity if you've got no other people around you. So vitally important for all these levels of human development to have the relationships right, which is why I'm so adamant that we should do as much as we can in school to do this relationships education in a really structured and developmental and safe way. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's my little, at least when we're changing slides, you get a little bit of a breather from my passionate rantings here. So just a quick summary then. Relationships are obviously important for survival. They affect brain development and health. They can affect our ability to self-regulate, not just because of the physiology of the brain, but because obviously learning to self-regulate, learning emotional literacy is actually modeled and taught. This can also affect our ability to collaborate in our learning. Collaborating in our learning is vital. It affects that internal picture, internal working model from which we see everything else. Relationships support our capacity to learn, and they shape our own relationships in the present and in the future, most significantly. So for all of these reasons and many more, we really need to do this well in school. Thank you. Next slide, please. So let's have a very quick refresher on what we need to do in terms of relationships education to meet the statutory requirements. Thank you. Next slide. So quick refresher on good old Ofsted. This is the first time, this Ofsted framework was honestly the first time in my nearly 40 years in education. I did get quite excited about it and stayed in the office till about 8 o'clock on a Friday night reading the framework, because these 4 key judgments are so important. But personal development being a key Ofsted judgment says a lot to me about how, and the statutory relationships education sits in there. So very important. And actually this work's kind of come quite a long way up the agenda in this recent couple of years. Next slide, please. And so I'm sure you know this already, but at primary school now, from this September now, although the DfE has given schools until next summer to really bit more leeway in terms of time to get this statutory relationships and health education into place. But you'll know then that relationships education is now statutory for primary schools. Parents can only withdraw their children from sex education, not from any aspect of relationships education. So hopefully this again stresses how important this work is. Thank you. Next slide. Yep. Oh, they are coming out quite funny, not like they look on my laptop, but that's okay. So just to say then, within the relationships education statutory guidance, you will be aware that there are these 5 strands of relationships education, and there are certain outcomes in each of the strands. 29 content expectations or statements. Children must know these things before the end of primary school. So obviously that's great. I would question, where is this element of relationship with self in here, because it isn't really there, not explicitly. But one of the things it does leave schools to do is actually work out, how are we going to break these the learning steps down for each of these 29 expectations to build a really progressive and developmental program to achieve these age appropriately and in a spiral curriculum through the primary school. Thank you. And the next slide, please. So again, this relationship with self, internal picture, vital, underpins all of those relationships education outcomes. Thank you. Next slide, please. And let's now go on then to look at how we do this, the how. How do we actually do this in it's just in a short space of time. This is just sort of broad brush, really, with a few examples thrown in. So how do we help children? How do we nurture relationship with self and others through all sorts of things, but particularly through a PSHE curriculum? Thank you. Next slide, please. So first of all, and this is all going to be really obvious, we create an ethos and a set of values in our school that includes every individual. So whilst the relationships education curriculum is absolutely vital, needs to be spiral, needs to be age appropriate and all of those things, it's only going to have a limited value if it's taught in isolation. So of course we've got to create this positive, inclusive ethos across the whole school community. Got to quite deliberately help children feel that sense of belonging, like they are valued here. And we've got to make relationship building a priority based on the 3 core conditions, I think, because that's nice and easy, which I'll come back to what those are in a moment. We've got to model healthy, positive relationships in our own relationships with other adults, with our relationship with the children, and helping them to have positive relationships with themselves. And we support all of this with a strong pastoral system. But let's just look for a moment at the relationships education. Thank you. Next slide, please. Brilliant. And the next one, please. Excellent. So the relationship with, this is an example which, if we could see the whole slide, it would be really helpful, because this just giving you an example of one of the activities from Jigsaw that can be really, really powerful. So what we do, we give children an outline of a gingerbread person, and we say, just fill it in any way you like, writing, drawing, just your real self. Who are you? How do you see yourself right now, your real self? And then we give them another gingerbread person outline, and we say, fill that one in in terms of the person you really, really would like to be. Now, in an ideal world, both of them will be exactly the same, and their children will be going, "What do you mean, miss? I've already done that on my real self one." However, what we tend to find is that very rarely is the case. What we do tend to find is, because the next bit of the exercise is, we say to children, if your real self and your ideal self, gingerbread people, are almost the same, put them close together. If they're exactly the same, put them on top of each other. If they're not the same at all, put them a distance apart to show how different they are. And the distance between the real self and the ideal self usually represents the lower the self-esteem. So the further apart, the lower the self-esteem. And I've done this work with children. I've had year 6 children take their ideal self and literally put it as far across the classroom as they can. So this work is absolutely crucial, I think, so that we can, because it really informs the amount of work we need to do on helping children like themselves, respect themselves for who they are. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we need to put this in a whole school curriculum, whatever that looks like for you. Now, Jigsaw is I tried to ensure with Jigsaw that we start as early as possible. So we have a lesson a week, 6 lessons every half term from age 3 all the way through to age 16. That way we can really make this a spiral curriculum and revisit the essential learning themes every year. Thank you. Next slide. And we have a whole school programme that is divided into 6 half-term units, and they're sequential through the school year. So you'll be able to see it being me in my world. Obviously, it's going to start with something about who am I, being me, and then how do I fit in my world, which might be my family, it might be as a global citizen. Celebrating difference, similarity and difference. How do I see myself? How am I the same as? How am I different? Dreams and goals, aspiration, dreams, healthy me. How do I look after myself and others? Then there's a whole unit on relationships. So lots of explicit work on relationships here, and then coping with change. But all the way through this program, these golden threads of relationships, values, and so on are running through whichever of the 6 modules you are teaching at the time. Thank you. Next slide. So this is just to reiterate that this is a spiral program, and I'm not for a minute trying to assume that or get you to all use Jigsaw, but whatever program you devise, the spiral nature of it, this revisiting of these key themes must be significant in there. And it takes a lot of working out, as you well know, to actually get this right, age appropriate, build every year. This does show the progression, though. When you see the long-term planning like this, you can see the progression in the content. Thank you. Let's move to the next slides, please. And the next one, please. And we do all of this work within a safe learning environment, and we make that safety explicit. For example, using a set of ground rules or Jigsaw. In Jigsaw, we call it the Jigsaw Charter. Always, whatever your ground rules look like, the right to pass needs to be there so that children never are put on the spot. They've always got to feel that sense of security. Like in this lesson, I'm not going to have to say anything if I don't want to. So absolutely essential. Thank you. Next slide, please. And you can see here, those of you who use Jigsaw, you'll be familiar with the lesson structure. But let me just reiterate why it looks like this in terms of relationships, education work. Obviously, in terms of building good relationships, we need to be able to have the social skills that enable that to happen. So once we've reinforced the Jigsaw Charter, the Connect Us activity is a game, but it's designed to build social skills so that we are quite explicitly and deliberately building those social skills with which children can collaborate and form better relationships. And then the calm me time. So the calm me time is our little bit of mindfulness practice in Jigsaw, where we're really helping children know how to relax their bodies and calm their minds, and at the same time gain an awareness of their thoughts and feelings. Because when you can gain more, when you're mindful of what's happening in your thoughts and feelings in the present moment, you are empowered to make your own decisions about how you respond to them. Now, if we could all do that as much of the time as possible in our relationships, we would probably be on a really good, we'd be a really helpful, positive thing, I think. And to help children do this, so they're aware of what they're thinking and feeling, and before it all explodes or whatever, they can actually think through that and make a decision about their response, then it's got to be a much more mindful way to be in friendships and relationships. Open my mind helps them focus on the learning. And then in the tell me or show me and the let me learn, we're actually teaching them very specific aspects, so relationship skills, specifically, so that we can practice things like conflict resolution, negotiation, communication, and so on. So those skills are important. But also we're creating a safe space to explicitly talk about relationships, whether it's be friendships, how to make friends, how to be a good friend, families, family composition, but as well as all those really good positive things about relationships in Jigsaw, and I think in any relationships education curriculum, we need to be equipping children to deal with the more tricky aspects of relationships. So what happens if a relationship, a friendship starts to go a bit wrong, or I start to not feel comfortable? Is it okay for me to leave this relationship? And if so, how do I do that? So all the way through Jigsaw, we're trying to lay these foundations of safeguarding, equipping children to understand what a healthy, positive relationship looks and feels like, in order to know when they're in one that isn't like that, and how to get help and how to speak up. So this is explicit teaching that we need to do with the knowledge base, considering all of these issues and giving children the skills to work with. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just is really just saying that in Jigsaw, we couple, every lesson has a purple learning intention and a green. The purple is the knowledge base, PSHE knowledge, and the green is social skills, emotional literacy. And we're trying to put those two things together so that, particularly in all of this, but in relationships education, it's no good us just knowing in a lesson how to do this. We need to have the emotional development and the social skills to be able to put that into practice. Thank you. Next. Again, I think we can flick through the next few, please, Graham, because if they're not going to come out clearly. Thank you. So just pause on this one for a sec. The solve it together technique is just one example of how we're trying to give children very specific techniques and strategies to use in their relationships. Thank you. And flicking on. Brilliant. As I said, we're also trying to give children opportunities to talk about relationships, the things that are trickier about relationships, like power, control, coercion, trying not to scare anybody, but to help children understand how to be assertive and how to understand how to keep themselves safe and how to have positive, healthy relationships. Thank you. And again, so how does this model make a difference to relationships? We've said we look at the inputs that we're giving, and that could be in in the nature of our relationships with young people, as well as in the explicit and implicit PSHE, RSHE curriculum. And then we work out, what can we teach explicitly? We can teach, and I believe we can teach all of this in age appropriate ways so that we're empowering children. Thank you. Next. I've talked a little bit about mindfulness, and I really believe that this mindfulness aspect is key because it empowers children to understand what's going on inside of them, and that internal picture is going to be key to what manifests externally. Next, please. And we do this mindfulness teaching in Jigsaw in lots of ways, explicitly in taught lessons, with Calm Me Time, with Jerry Cat and his big paws. He has pause points in the lessons, reinforced through the assemblies and so on. Thank you. Next, please. And all of this we're going to put into the whole school approach, knowing that every aspect of every day in school is going to be inputting to children's picture of who they are, and that in turn is going to be making a difference to the relationships that they have and they build. So if you just keep going, please, Graham. So in Jigsaw, we've got assemblies, because coming together in an assembly obviously is going to give a sense of belonging and community. We've got songs, because singing together gives also that sense of belonging and community and uplifts us. Thank you. Next. We have weekly celebrations where we are going to focus on one attitude or one behavior each week, which is going to enable us to praise each other, look for the good in people, and so on. All of these things helping us with relationships. Thank you. We're going to praise children, really with very specific praise, that we've noticed they can do this and they've learnt this, and then we'll encourage them to say what they're proud of, again building that internal picture. Again, thank you, Graham. We're going to bring all children's work together to create whole school displays and find any ways we can to bring children's work together to show that we value every individual. Thank you. We're going to create, so this, I put this picture in because to me, when you put a boat in a cradle, you're putting it in there to build it or mend it. And I think that the relationships we create in schools through our relationships education and PSHE can kind of hold children in the same way while they grow and possibly while we help them mend. Next. So I've gone on and on and on about relationship with self. And I guess one of the last things I want to really say is it's all very well to talk about this in terms of children, because of course that's what our vocation is. But actually we do also need to step back and think, am I doing this for myself too? Because I am instrumental in helping these children build relationships with themselves and with others. Thank you. Next. Very quickly, the core conditions. So Carl Rogers, famous psychologist, said to build any relationship, you need these three core conditions or ingredients. The first one being unconditional positive regard, then empathy, then congruence. So congruence, just being real, being yourself, being authentic. They look quite easy, but I'll leave you to have a think about any occasions or any children you might have met in your career so far, and those situations when any one of those conditions didn't feel quite so easy and you had to really, really work hard at it. Thank you. I'm sure you've seen this, but if you haven't seen Rita Pierson's TED Talk called Every Kid Needs a Champion, take a few minutes to watch it. It kind of sums up in a brilliant way what I've tried to say today. It's really quite inspiring. Thank you. Next. So I've tried to whistle through a little bit of theory. I've tried to just refresh us on the statutory requirements for relationships education and make a few suggestions about how in a whole school relationships education program, underpinned by the relationships we are nurturing ourselves, and how we're modeling those, how we can really do this vitally important work for children. And the last slide, if you could move to the last one, Graham, I just want to leave you with this poem, really one of my favourites, because I think this sort of says it all, really. If we get our relationships right in school, and then children will feel safe and they will feel that they're in a place where they can learn, and indeed they want to learn. So thank you. I'm sorry about the dodgy slides here and there. I'm sorry for whistling through this at a rate of knots, but thank you for your patience. I hope there was at least a few things in there that might give you a little bit more food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. That was so interesting. I was trying to keep up typing notes as well as watching the chat and things like that. But it was a whistle-stop tour, so it was really interesting for me to find out more about Jigsaw, because I know it is a scheme that I used in one of my schools, but I wasn't so familiar with it. But also relating it to Ofsted, always useful, and but also that work on yourself and the relationship with yourself. I think we'll all find that useful, not just for ourselves, but working with the children in the classroom. So thank you for that. Sarah, can defo recommend the Rita TED Talk. Thanks for that, Sarah. She's one of our experts in mental health and support for children and staff. So that's good.
Brilliant.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to add anything or say anything at the end. Yeah, some thank yous going on there now. So thanks ever so much, Jan. We've got to finish now because you've got to get ready for the next one. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.